I'm Bryan O'Hara. I'm a vegetable grower in Connecticut. And let's see, we've been practicing no-till vegetable production on our farm for about 6 or 7 years, completely in no-till. We grow about 3 acres of vegetables. It's a very intensive production system. We grow vegetables year-round, about an acre under low and high tunnels. And the system of no-till that we utilize, which I'll be discussing today, has proven to be very economically rewarding, both in terms of reduced labor and increased yields and quality of the vegetables. This system that I'm going to describe obviously is set up for our farm in Connecticut and under our soil and environmental conditions. You all may well be under different conditions. If you follow this system exactly, you will probably have very, very good results. But most people aren't ready to follow another system exactly, and instead you will glean things and be able to utilize them on your farm. And I've seen that done numerous times, and sometimes it's tremendously successful, and sometimes some little detail is missed and things go awry. So, you know, just as a pre-warning, but I'll try to get you as much information as possible and cover as much detail as possible. You know, what I really like about intensive vegetable production and being around the home all the time and the human labor aspect of it is that it's very family-centered, in that I can have my daughter working right with me all the time. I'm not driving around on all the tractors all the time. I got, you know, everything is right there. I can yell to my wife if I, you know, need to tell her something. Vice versa, which there's a lot of. You know, my parents are involved, you know, young children, you know, it's very family oriented. And that way everybody's gainfully doing something useful, and there maintains a level of family happiness, which is really critical to me, probably critical to a lot of you. Obviously, if we wanted to make money and not have a nice life, we probably wouldn't be doing this, you know? We'd be doing something else. Let me talk about tillage and the lack thereof and what we generally do in terms of managing a no-till system. Our fields, we switched them into no-till after years of tillage. So we had been tilling the soil for maybe 10, 15 years, and we were doing 3 or 4 crops a season, and the level of tillage was destroying the soil structure. It was pulverizing the soil, particularly a rototiller would just cream all our beautiful aggregation and worm crumbs. And though the soils were highly amended with compost and various fertilizers, calcium, you know, trace minerals, everything, we were still lacking in an appropriate soil structure and aggregation. So progressively, we moved away from tillage. First, we established permanent wheel tracks so that we're no longer driving over the fields willy-nilly. So we're always over the same beds. Then we started switching away from tools like the rototiller, and we switched into just using discs and field cultivators and tined harrows to re-prep the bed and rollers to reset the soil, until we finally got to a point, well, maybe about 10 years ago, we started experimenting with various no-till systems, which included mowing down a flowering rye crop and strip tilling into it, or laying down heavy mulches and then removing the mulches to seed beds or planting through heavy mulches. So we started experimenting with all these no-till systems. However, when we ran into Korean natural farming and started contacting the practitioners of Korean natural farming, which is very popular in Hawaii, Korean natural farming uses a lot of what's called indigenous microorganisms, which is a culture that you make of fungal organisms. And they really discourage tillage on farms because, of course, you're encouraging all this fungal organisms. You're going through all this effort to make a fungal culture and apply it to your fields, and then it's just very damaging to come in there with tillage equipment, especially something like a rototiller. So they really pushed us and encouraged us into setting up a system of complete no-till. And so that's what we did. We had to develop a system on the farm that was versatile enough that we can grow 3, 4, 5 crops in a given season and be able to not till the soil in order to achieve that. So we set up and developed this whole system on farm. One of the concepts in the system is the use of layering materials. Since we're not tilling the soil and we do apply compost every year, we layer composts and mulch materials on the surface of the soil. And that is one of the general conditions that the soil, it has a layered system of soil fertility built on top of it. Another important concept is the use of mowing and solarizing of the crop residues that we're left with after a crop or a cover crop, which I'll show you pictures of in a minute. So those were a couple of the big breakthroughs for us, creating a weed-free compost for application to the surface of the soil and being able to deal with all that crop residue. Those were a couple of major points to switch us into full no-till. Let me just cover quickly, some of the dangers of tillage and how no-till has dramatically improved our yields. So in terms of what happens in the soil under a tillage system, and this is what we were seeing in the field. So we would come in with plows, harrows, or whatnot, rototillers, and we were under a traditional tillage system. And of course, what happens then is the tillage equipment creates the tillage plow pan underneath the loosened aerated area. So you come in with your tillage implement and you loosen this soil, whatever, 8, 10 inches of soil. And that is now an aerated tillage fluffed soil. That underneath that fluffed soil, the tillage implement, of course, has smeared the soil. The plow, the pressure to plow against, because you're pulling the plow, of course, smearing the soil, tillers smashing the soil underneath, harrow, weight down, tractor tires. That all results in a compacted layer underneath the tillage layer. Then with the pulverization of the soil, you end up with lack of proper soil structure leading to usually a crusting across the surface of the soil. So what that looks like traditionally, and you see it everywhere, is a crusted surface, highly oxygenated tillage layer, and a compacted lower topsoil layer. And so in terms of what that does to plant growth in soil biology is, the tillage layer is over-oxygenated and you've just creamed all kinds of different organisms, leading to a tremendous increase in bacterial activity, which releases a tremendous flush of nutrients, which as farmers, we generally try to capitalize on the use of a tillage implement, basically, just releasing a bunch of nutrients from the soil. Of course, it's at the expense of future biological activity, but you get a nutrient release from the use of a tillage implement, which gives you a flush of growth. And so you can utilize that, and you can capture that flush of growth, and you can sell a crop, and then maybe rotate out and go over there and do it over there, and wait for the soil to recover over there. And that's, traditional American extensive agricultural systems. However, we're under an intensive system, so we couldn't be doing that all the time. So that flush of growth has a tendency to be, of course, weak and imbalanced. Usually too much nitrogen, too much potassium, and lack of trace elements. And that's what we were seeing in our tissue analysis when we would test the tissues of our crops. Very, very common in vegetable production to be high in nitrogen and potassium and low in your trace elements. So, but not only have you destroyed the fungal organisms, which give you your trace elements, and over-oxygenated the soil and destroyed the future aggregation of the soil through the use of the tillage implement, but you also created this condition of the crusting of the soil. And the soil, of course, breathes. It breathes in the air feeds the aerobic soil organisms oxygen, and the soil life then exhales carbon dioxide in respiration. And so the carbon dioxide coming out of the soil, being a heavier component of air, lingers underneath the crop canopy. And the carbon dioxide, of course, for photosynthesis, feeds into the crop canopy readily. So a breathing soil feeds your soil aerobic organisms, which are the ones, that are going to give you that steady, rich, trace mineral rich nutrient release, and feeds the carbon dioxide in for photosynthesis. If the soil crusts over, you get a lack of soil respiration, and as well, it upsets the whole air and water ratio in the soil, because of course the rain won't penetrate, it'll run off, and you can end up with a drying soil, which is very detrimental to biological systems. I should just briefly mention, of course, in order to grow disease-resistant crops, what we're really looking for, and when I talk about compost and fertilizers, I'm going to be talking about this more, but the nutrients need to be released from biological systems, not direct feeding of fertilizer materials into your crops. You want a steady biological release of nutrients to keep your crop healthy. So everything that you can do to keep that biology in place and operational is your primary concern. So to avoid the crusting is very important. Obviously, we used to go through and we would just break up the crust with cultivation equipment or mulch over the soil to avoid the crusting altogether. But the crusts always needed to be addressed. And obviously, with the excessive aeration of the soil, when we were under a tillage system, we would recompact the beds with rollers. Very important tool under a tillage system is to recompact. So, but we've moved away from all those things. Now, the plow pan is detrimental in that it blocks the movement of water both down and up. So just imagine a crusted, aerated plow pan soil. Heavy rain, okay? The heavy rain makes it through the crusted soil, readily drains through the over-aerated tillage layer, and then sits on top of the plow pan, creating an anaerobic condition right at the plant roots, where the plant roots are piled up because they can't even effectively penetrate the plow pan. So, and that, of course, rots the plant roots. And you, up here on the soil surface, 10 inches above that rotted plant root, don't even know that that's what's going on down there. So, obviously pull out plants and look at their roots and make sure, that everything's going well with the rooting system. But that plow pan is very detrimental for the pooling of water in the root zone. Potentially even worse is the fact that the soil is actually a sponge and moves water upwards from, lower levels of the subsoil where there's a lot more moisture down there, right? So if the soil is effectively working with a proper soil structure, water just readily moves up like a forest. The forest is very difficult for a forest to get into a drought condition. The water moves up from subsurface, subsoil layers into the topsoil, critical to maintaining that even balance of air and water, which sustains the biological system to give the even nutrient release into the crop. So what it looks like under you've got a double whammy. You've got a plow pan under the tillage. Even if you smash the plow pan with a chisel plow or another tool, the soil is still, the soil structure where you tilled is still non-homogeneous with the underlayers and will not wick water effectively. So tillage, the classic tillage scenario is for that soil that you loosened with a tillage implement to get dried out in a summertime condition because of all those factors. Now, when the soil dries out, you have a biological crash. And I saw it so many times when we were under a tillage system. You know, we would get into a dry period, soil would start drying, I'd start firing up the irrigation system. Irrigation does not replace that natural balance. If there is a biological crash, the organisms do not just spring back. You know, if the soil dried out and you come in with irrigation, things are not hunky-dory the next day. It takes like a month for that biological system to reestablish and rehydrate and get everything reestablished and functioning again. And not only that, but of course, irrigation is tremendously easy to overdo. And also, there's a lot of water quality issues with irrigation. It's not the same as rain, nor is it the same as a aggregated soil that evenly maintains its air to water ratio in the soil. So it's not as simple as adding irrigation water to reestablish this balance which nature would naturally have in place. So all those factors are, in a nutshell, the dangers of tillage, which is not to say that we don't still till occasionally, especially to bring a new field into production. And I'll cover that after I talk about our no-till system. This is what you're looking for, essentially, and that is a darkened soil, well aggregated crumb structure to the soil. Just so you know what it looks like, you can reach your hand into the soil. You can put your hand, I could probably easily put my hand up to my wrist just by reaching into the soil in this kind of soil. Not excessively loose, but able to get your hand down in there. Obvious presence of earthworms, fungal activity, all on the crop residues and straw that's in place there. So that's what the objective is in the modern production system. That's what we're looking for. Now, how are we going to get to that? So now, when we talk about breathing soils, I'm going to talk about the nice side of a no-till soil now, how things can actually function really well. So take a no-till soil with a crumbed structure and no plow pan. So in that scenario, the soil, which is open to the air with all its little crumbs, the oxygen and air moves into the soil, nitrogens, moves into the soil organisms breathe freely, they exhale carbon dioxide freely, they fix the nitrogen from the air, the carbon dioxide, which is a heavier component of the air, rises up out of the soil, open flow in and out. Carbon dioxide comes up, the stomatas of your leaf canopy, on the bottom of the leaves, heavier component of air, the carbon dioxide for your crop growth is generated from the soil organisms right underneath it. So that is how the whole cycle works. So air, very important. The balancing of the air and water in the soil, nature is incredibly complex. That soil is structured exactly naturally the way those organisms that are in that soil need it, okay? You know, that soil, its structure, its development, its characteristics have led to a microbiology that is appropriate for that soil and appropriate for the ability of that soil to keep a certain air and water balance. And so your native microbiology is very delicate. If you artificially mess that all up, you've got the wrong organisms in the soil as well. And so it gets back to that being able to cycle in an anaerobic cycling as one gains greater dominance and the other, they go back and forth, and they give you your nutrient release, which is also a very steady condition that the plants want and have developed under thousands and thousands of years under these kinds of natural systems. So then on top of that, when you look at the other side of the soil and how well structured, I'm going to mention more about a destructured soil in terms of killing those microbiology, but let's just talk about the plow pan. If there's no plow pan in place, the soil moisture from the subsurface, subsoil layers actively and can move upwards into the structured soil. So in other words, the soil is a sponge. And that's why a forest doesn't dry out in a drought unless it's absolutely catastrophic drought. You know, the forest soils, they're covered on the surface, they're aggregated, and they also are of homogeneous, strong structural characteristics that allow water to move upwards. If you till a soil, water can't move up that destructured soil. And so you have to irrigate that excessively loosened tilled layer and keep it hydrated either through rain or irrigation water. It loses its capacity, even if the plow pan isn't in place, because it's been destructured and is no longer a sponge. So again, that gets back to management. However, people don't really generally understand the ramifications of letting that soil dry out. That tilled layer, if that soil actually dries out and gets into a dry condition like a drought soil, or even, you know, just not enough moisture in it, there's a huge biological crash that accompanies that drying of that tilled layer. That even if you allow that soil to dry out and you re-irrigate it, it is not going to just spring back to life like that. The biology has to regrow itself, reestablish its balance, and get back into a functioning state, which can take weeks, potentially, or longer. Does your tomato plant have that much time to allow a soil to dry out and then rehydrate it, wait for the microbes to come back on? No, they need constant, steady, very, very steady nutrient release for healthy, appropriate crop growth. So those are all the potential damages of tillage, and some of the reasons why a no-till system functions so well. It has a lot to do with microbes and water and air balancing. So I'm going to start from the beginning, and how do we get into a no-till field situation? Basically, the earth is covered in a perennial plant growth. And we, as vegetable growers, are trying to move it into an annual cropping system. So inherently, as vegetable growers, we are seeking to radically alter the natural environment and put our will and our crop production in place. So by the very context of vegetable growing, we are already asking a great deal of nature, okay? We're removing nature's natural perennial cover and putting our idea in place. Step one, okay? So now we've got to do that very gently. However, you do have to get started. And so when we come into a new field and that is in sod, we plow and we till. We bring this into traditional no-till situation through regular tillage equipment. And I'm going to discuss how we do that. There are options to do it differently, but this is the way we would start out a new field. You know, it's in sod. So we start with plowing, and immediately then we would harrow this field. That is not a picture of a harrow. So we plow in the morning and harrow in the afternoon, because you don't want the furrows out drying unnecessarily in the sun. So you want to, as soon as you plow a soil, you want to get it smoothed back over as soon as possible. So plow, harrow. If the field, it would be best to do that in the fall if you're looking at a spring crop production. However, and then if you plowed and harrowed in the fall, cover crop it, work the cover crop into the soil surface, and begin in the spring with reprepping into your bed format and start your shaping. However, I will run through the sequence just as if you were starting in the spring very quickly without the break for the cover crop. So it would be plow, harrow. Then we would come in and shape the beds into their actual 58-inch bed, which fits this Super C tractor with the roller. So our bed shaping equipment is very simple. It's just two large discs mounted on the cultivator frame with a large roller following the tractor. So it throws the soil up out of the wheel track. We roll it over, and the roller is a very important tool for tillage, because tillage has artificially, excessively loosened the soil. So rollers all the time, whatever tillage tool you're using. So But anyway, establishing a permanent bedding system is what we would do next. And I'll talk about how we got to no-till with reduced tillage, but I'm just going to finish this sequence first. But the permanent bedding system was an important step towards movement into no-till. So plow, harrow, bed shape, and then I'm going to go backwards a slide to the chisel plow. And then once our bed shape is in, then we're going to chisel plow. Once those beds are formed from the moldboard plow and harrowing, we will forever be on a permanent bedding system. In other words, the plow and harrow are broad acre implements where you're driving all over the field. Once those beds have been shaped by the tractor, it's permanent. And now individual beds will be worked with individual tillage implements. There'll never be another moldboard plow situation on the field. So the beds are established now. We run a chisel plow through the bed surface, usually 2 of them for a 58-inch bed. So there'd be a second one mounted on the toolbar. This chisel plow was very inexpensive. All it is the actual chisels purchased from Market Farm Implement and mounted onto the 1.5-inch toolbar on the rear of the tractor. So I didn't buy a special chisel plow whole plow apparatus. I simply adapted 2 chisels onto the existing toolbar, and it's worked fine for years, chisel plowing. So then we run 2 chisels down the bed, and then after it is chiseled, we would either re-roll or run a field cultivator, which would be cultivator tines mounted on the cultivation rig of the tractor, or a rear-mounted field cultivator, which is just the tines, shovels. Not sweeps, but pointed shovels, points run through to eliminate any kind of perennial weeds that might be still present, namely quackgrass. Now, this particular field, when we plowed up, this example didn't actually have any quackgrass, so it wasn't even required to run through with a field cultivator. But if there is quackgrass in the field, what we do is we run the field cultivator rig through the beds every 2 weeks until the quackgrass has been eliminated. We'll actually switch even into what's called a rod weeder, which is it's kind of like a spring tooth harrow. It's a bunch of small tines, and we'll field cultivate the first time or second time and then run a rod weeder just over the surface for the last few passes until the quackgrass is cleaned up. Because it is very important, what I'm describing here is when we get into the no-till system, the enemies of the no-till system are perennial weeds. So the system that I will be discussing here can deal with annual weeds, which are normal weeds under vegetable production. However, you have to take the time to set the stage correctly so that you're not dealing with perennial weeds getting into your field crop system. So that's why we're very thorough about initial tillage. So other options to get into perennial free weed area is to solarize under black plastic. There's a silage tarp, and this is being utilized for a Canada thistle infestation, where very difficult to till our way out of Canada thistle. So, however, Canada thistle does grow through the winter time, so we're able to solarize using, black plastic solarization, essentially, through the winter time to eliminate Canada thistle. So this black plastic went down probably in October and got removed at the end of May, and was successful in removing Canada thistle from the field.
Why is that better than clear plastic?
Well, I'm going to talk about clear plastic solarization primarily. This blots out sun. In the winter, clear plastic acts as a greenhouse. And so if you're going to solarize something in the winter, you need to blot out the sun. But when we solarize almost everything, which I'll be talking extensively about during the summer, then it's all clear plastic. Yeah. And we did cut some holes in that to let a little moisture through so that the soil would stay hydrated under there. And I've seen this repeated on numerous other farms in my area, and this has been successful for Canada thistle. And you don't really lose a full season of production by eliminating it from like mid-fall through mid-spring. So I've seen that done, and that certainly was successful for us as well. So that is one option, though. You could cover an area with no tillage, and I'm going to discuss why we don't do that in a second. And then our other option is you can use organic materials to smother out your perennial growth, which would be, some people use cardboard with like straw or sawdust on the top of it. This particular effort was sawdust mixed with a nitrogen-rich fertilizer, which then heats up to burn out was quackgrass underneath the end of this bed. So the quack would just come through sawdust, but the heat of composting, essentially a mulch on top of the perennials, was enough to burn out the perennial growth. Another experiment we did from a fellow who cuts a lot of hay was we piled about 2 feet of fresh cut hay on top of a quackgrass area, and that also burned out the quackgrass. So you can use organic materials, especially heating of organic materials, to eliminate perennial weeds as well. Like I said, perennials in this system is your enemy. So generally, I don't use hay anywhere that would be a problem. However, that was specifically mown hay that we utilized. He cut his really early before it went to seed and piled it that way, and we cut ours in that experiment really late. And so a lot of seed heads actually shattered. But yes, you're absolutely right. You got to watch out for, you have to be very cautious. Obviously, piling it and letting it heat does help destroy some of the weed seeds. But hay is generally pretty much the enemy of this system, as I'll be discussing it. And now I'm going to discuss why we go actually with tillage to get the things up and running, as opposed to these smothering techniques. And we use tillage in order to essentially initially aerate and break up the soil, which inevitably in our case has always got a plow pan in it from poor agricultural techniques in the past. So you could smother out the soil and get some deep-rooted perennial or deep-rooted cover crops in there and start trying to break up the plow pan. I mean, I've heard that that's been done. We personally don't do that. We get in there, we eliminate the perennials with thorough tillage, we break up the plow pan with the chisel plow, and we shape the beds and get everything all in order, and then we get off the field with the tillage implements. So now let me get into how we actually handle the no-till system and get a lot of vegetable crops grown, so that now that you know some of the like dynamics of the system, how actually do we achieve that in the field? So to start with, I'm just going to start with, I discussed getting a field into production system. I mean, we would obviously cover crop it after that tillage sequence to get it started up. I mean, you could get right into vegetables, but let's just start with a cover crop or an existing vegetable crop. The first thing that we're going to do is we have a field now with either an annual cover crop or an annual vegetable crop in it. And the first thing that we're going to do now is we are going to mow the residue off. And generally, at this point, we use this mowing machine, which is a BCS 2-wheel power unit. That's a rotary mower on the front. It's got a sickle bar mower that can be front mounted over there as well. And that's our primary mowing machine. We do have tractor mounted mowers, and we have hand tools, size, sickles, machetes, all that kind of thing. But generally, this is the machine. We like the maneuverability of it and the lightweight nature of it, so that we're not putting tractors on the field unnecessarily. And it's very effective. You're right there with it, and it grinds up residue. They make flail mowers for it. A flail mower might be an excellent choice for a machine like this. We just happen to have the rotary mower and sickle bar when we bought this machine, so those are the ones that we have used. They're very effective, and let me just show you that in action now. So this is no-till basically at its simplest, which is there was a salad green lettuce bed in between these rows of tomatoes, and the farm is very intensively cropped. There's basically maximum vegetative coverage at all times on basically all beds. So obviously this lettuces had grown too big. They had already been harvested, whatnot. However, it was timed. Obviously we knew that those lettuces would be done. We're going to mow them off, and now we have room for our tomatoes to grow out, and we can work the tomato beds. So in this case, the simplest of no-till is simply mow it off. Lettuce roots, not particularly vigorous, and we'll just mulch it over.
How do you maintain those tomatoes while that lettuce is growing? How do you get in and out?
Yeah, everything is really dense, and we are just basically tippy-toeing around in our crop. So we don't wear shoes, and we use human effort. So, oh yeah, this is still vegetative. So it was just trellising at this point. Pruning the lower leaves and trellising at this point. So exactly, it's not terrible. We haven't gotten, but yes, it was time so that at harvest time, now we've got room to start working. But yeah, then that is the intensity that you're going to see in these pictures. I mean, the field is stuffed full of vegetation. There's very narrow walkways. If you step on a plant, it's fine because there's tons more of them, and you just work down the rows that way. So, but this is at its simplest. Simply mowed it off. This is years ago. This is probably actually a hay straw mixture where we used to use really late cut hay for its less seed content. However, we have gotten away from that because it gave us too much dock and Canada thistle. So we don't actually use hay anymore in the mulching, but that's pretty much no-till at its most basic. Just smother it over. By the time the tomatoes are harvested in end of September or so, all this will be pulled out and all the beds will be replanted. The lettuce roots will have rotted under the mulch. You pull the mulch aside and reseed into a bed. So just using organic materials to kill off a previous growing crop. Just simple example. And I might as well mention at this point that we didn't just jump into no-till one day. We practiced with different no-till techniques for probably over 10 years. And so at first it was just things like that, mulching a bed heavily, and then if there's no need to till, there's no needs, there's no weeds, there's no crop, we just would separate the mulch off and transplant through it or seed down it after it's raked off. And we did things like mowed down, the rye at flowering, and just ripped furrows and seeded winter squash into a dead, rye crop. And so we started off with just little experiments, and then we started doing some of these more complex things, and there was just more and more success. And that's the same with the tillage. We were under a full tillage system of all kinds of tillage tools. We would retill between, some of these fields produced 3, 4, 5 vegetable crops in a season. There was a tillage event between each of those croppings. And bed shaping and rollers and, everything was straight and flat and very, very pretty at the time, I thought. Now I think it's not so pretty. But and now I think this is pretty, which just, is a different viewpoint. But so we steadily reduced tillage. Like I told you, one of the first moves was just to get to a permanent bedding system. And then once we were on a permanent bedding system, that also eliminated moldboard plowing and broad field harrowing. But we would just handle each bed separately with tillage tools, which initially was the rototiller shallow and the chisel plow deep. And then, along with the roller to recompress. And then we moved into just using harrows on the surface instead of the rototiller, both disc or tined. And once we moved out of that to just no-till. So it was like a steady reduction in tillage over the years, experimenting with different no-till techniques until we came to a complete no-till system a number of years ago. So here's just another example of, this is the end of a garlic harvest, and there's a few garlics down on the corner there still left, but this is just showing that often there are no weeds because once the system was up and running, there's really not many weeds in the whole system. So, there's no need to till after so many of the crops because there is nothing to till after the crops. There's a couple weeds. We'll walk through there with a hoe and knock those things off. This has already been reseeded here. So this is how we handle most crop residues and cover crops for getting our new crop in place, which is solarization with clear plastic. And so this is generally what replaces tillage in order to eliminate the previous crop. You know, you can smother, you can do different things, but by and large, this is the most prevalent technique that we utilize. And so I believe a cover crop was in place here. And you can see that it is browned off. And solarization, you see that we use plastic bags. These are 4 mil greenhouse, 4 mil construction grade plastics or leftover hoop tunnel plastics. And basically we mow the residue and then immediately cover it. And that is 24 hours. So we generally remove the cover after 24 hours. If we wanted to finish off these last few that are right along the side, because air is obviously your enemy getting under that tarp, you could leave it for a second day. It would polish off more of them. However, generally we prefer to remove the plastic as quickly as possible, and we'll just whack off whatever few weeds made it through or plants with a grub hoe. That is what you're looking at for a surface. Pretty rough often. This one wasn't mowed particularly low, but let me discuss the dynamics of solarizing. As I said, air getting under the cover is obviously going to keep things cooler. So the lower you mow the residue, the tighter the fit, the better the solarization. Now, if it's summertime and it's 85, 90 degrees out, you barely have to do anything. You just knock stuff down and throw a tarp over and it'll kill it. If it's 70 or 75 degrees in May and you're trying to solarize rye, winter rye, which is a real tough plant, you're going to need to mow it low and get that cover tight over the surface. So it's a gamut and full range of how much you've got to mow in order to effectively solarize. But the plastic, generally we try to just go for 24 hours, one day in the hot sun. It's got to be sunny. And so generally, you can solarize at about 70, but for reliable solarization, sunny and 75 degrees is best, or above. And the hotter it gets, the more effective, really. And so if it's 75 degrees and like you said, you're trying to solarize winter rye in May, you might need 3 or 4 days under a cover. But by and large, for almost all the things we solarize, except for those early heavy cover crops and things, it's just one day, 24 hours, and we're back in there with another crop. So is the biology impacted by the solarization? That's precisely why we remove it after 24 hours instead of letting the cover sit for more time than that. Now, we've measured air temperature under the cover. I believe it's like a 40, 50 degree air temperature gain on the sun. So, an 80 degree day, it's going to be 120, 130 air temperature under the cover. And that kills the freshly mown annual root extremely effectively. It is not going to kill a perennial root. So that's why perennials can't enter into this system. If you need to kill perennial roots, you're better off with a black plastic to blot out the sun from the perennial root. But black plastics in the sun in the summer can start leading to biological damage to the soil surface. So the clear plastic for one day, 40 degree heat gain, the soil temperature, when we measured it, and this is farmers out in the field with temperature gauges, I'm not a scientist, but it was roughly about a 10 degree, a little less maybe, soil temperature gain in that top inch. So instead of the soil temperature being 70 that day, it was 80. And I'm sure that some surface microbes got fried and there was a little disturbance, but we haven't seen any dramatic detrimental impact from such a short solarization event. Obviously there's going to be a little damage. You're going to fry some spiders, this kind of thing and whatnot. And but compared to a tillage event, it seems dramatically improved. So, but yes, that is why we go so quickly with the covers. So I have a sequence. Oh, let me show you this first. So this is an example of a really tough thing to solarize. This is rye with crimson clover. And so in terms of cover cropping, it has to all be annuals because solarizing as our primary means of eradicating vegetative growth, if it was a perennial clover, it would live through the solarization event. So we have to work with annuals in the cover cropping system. So there's a mixture of rye and crimson clover. The rye is huge in this. It's like 7 feet tall. The crimson clover is mixed into it. There's a picture at the other end of the field where you can see it more dominant with the crimson clover. But this is an example of, and you can kind of see the crimson clover underneath the rye canopy there. But this is how we handle such a heavy growth of rye. So in this case, we've mown off a 1/4 acre, let it solarize under the plastics for 3 days probably. This is May. This is a heavy cover crop. And then mowed the next 1/4 acre and move the plastics up the 1/4 acre. So we don't have acres of plastic. We have a 1/4 acre of plastic that we move around the fields and cover the areas with. And that gives us time while that's solarizing. Then we're seeding and transplanting and composting and fixing up this 1/4 acre. And so we move over the fields in a rotation of moving these materials around. Yeah, so there's a better close-up picture of, the really tall rye vegetation and the crimson clover underneath it. And, it does show that it is a fertile field condition. The cover crops grow like mad. The crops grow really, really well. And there's a lot of residue left from something like that when you chop it up and mow it. So we rotary mowed that 7-foot tall rye. And yes, it would have been easier to come through with a flail mower and chop it up quicker. However, since, as I said, I don't own a flail mower, I just hold the rotary mower up by pushing down, and totally, it's a workout. And so first pass, chops it down, gets it knocked over, and then the next passes, it takes 3 passes through a 7-foot tall rye crop to chop it up to this level. I could have sickle bar mowed it off, obviously, very easily, but then my fibers would have been long, and I would have to bring them back or run the chopper and chop them up to really utilize the straw the way we like to utilize it. So it would have been a whole extra management step if I was going to sickle bar it. So I just rotary mow it using that tool that we have. Sickle bar is obviously easier, though. And that is the material we're left with on the soil surface. And so you can see that now the solarization event has killed any leftover weeds. The chopped rye is already on the surface in clover mix. So I got nitrogen-rich and clover chopped rye mixture on the soil surface. And all the slugs have been decimated through a large-scale solarization event. I can now just set seedlings into this if I want to, and it would require liquid fertilization if I was going to do that, with no pre-plant compost or anything, but we certainly have done that. So the field is completely mulched, ready to go, set to transplants, and you're off and running. Very little slug damage compared to the days when we would just try to mow off a rye crop and rip slots and put transplants or seeds into mowed slots. We would have trouble with slug damage. So this kind of solarization event really reduced a main problem with no-till, which is slugs. So yes, now if we're going to direct seed, which is primarily what we do, is we would take just rakes, big hay rake type things. I think that is what's going on here, where these beds have been raked and the straw has been put into the wheel tracks, kind of roughly. It's hard to see, but we'll pile it up, just a couple beds, 3 beds at a time, and then we'll come through with compost application, which is generally we do a pre-plant compost application. So we'll move the mulch aside, compost the bed, which in this case, I bring a dump truck. There's a manure spreader that fits on the bed, but just because the piles are down the road, I have to bring a dump truck, which fits over the bed surface, and we dump spread over the bed surface, and then get that smoothed out. We seed into the compost residue, and then reapply the mulch over the seed. So the mulch is grown right next, or right on, essentially, where it needs to be placed. All the fields that we've worked on have been relatively well amended with things like lime and things in the past. So we were never in a position where we needed a lot of mineral amendment into the field. We certainly amend them regularly, but if a field needed a lot of limestone, we would have incorporated that into that initial tillage sequence to get the limes mixed into the soil and things like that. So, but barring any kind of really major need of mineral or nutrient, we allow all materials just to be worked in from the organisms bringing it into the soil, which become incredibly abundant. The earthworm activity and the microbes, it just is outrageously fast-moving decomposition system that they have in place now. What do we do with like more woody residues? This soil is highly functioning and can eat anything. We put wood right on the surface of the soil, so it's never a problem with something being too carbonaceous. However, some things are too hard to deal with, and that would include the tomatoes, which have too much trellising mixed into them. So we manually remove the tomatoes with all the twine for trellising and things like that, because it would get mixed into the chopping machine and things like that. So we just have these machete axe-like things that we just whack off the roots, and those get bundled up and tossed into the compost pile. Sweet corn, we do the same thing with. We never really have been able to mow sweet corn or grain corn even stems effectively, really. So we'll usually just whack those down with a machete too. But barring that, pretty much everything grinds up. We can run over eggplant and pepper and chop them up. The peppers, sometimes we've got them trellised too. So those, mostly it's trellising that gets in our way, twine from trellising. But everything else just gets chopped up. The carbon on top does not lock up the nitrogen in the soil. Now, that is because it would be catastrophic to mix that carbon into the soil, of course. But carbon on the soil surface is brought down into the soil at the rate that the biology is prepared to bring it down. So you're working with natural systems. They know how much to bring into the soil at a given time. Now, that may well be very different for a soil that is not functioning well. So these fields, the biological activity is extremely high. They are ready to decompose anything in mass. We can use straight wood chip on these fields as a mulch, and crops grow great. Now, is a field that is on a lower biological activity with a lower nitrogen content in place going to do as well under a wood chip mulch? Possibly not. So, and I'll talk about that in the second half, about kind of getting into your carbon to nitrogen ratio and trying to balance how you handle your carbon materials and your nitrogen rich materials in context of your cover cropping, of your selection of mulch materials, in terms of your composting and application of other fertilizer materials. So obviously the attractiveness of this system is its ability to terminate the pre-existing vegetative cover, which, that's always been the limitation of organic no-till, is you have to wait till the cover crop was the right flowering period, or you had just the right crop that you could remove without tillage or that kind of thing. What this system offers us through the quick solarization is ability to terminate anything at any time. Well, at least from May to October with the solarization event, because that's in Connecticut anyway. That's when we get 75 plus degrees weather. Sometimes you'll get it in April. Sometimes, maybe you'll get a little bit in November or something down in Connecticut. But essentially, May through October, maybe a little less for you guys, May through September or something here, is your solarizing period. In the wintertime, when we need to terminate a crop, we have to actually hoe it out, generally, is what we do, unless like freezing temperatures would terminate the crop or something like that. But if it's some leftover lettuces in November and we need to put the next crop of spinach in, we have very wide hoes, and we just chop off after mowing. We'll chop off any root residues, which is not particularly difficult for us, because that's really a limited occasion to terminate a crop in the winter, or late fall or winter, early spring. And the vegetation that we're eliminating is usually quite weak. It's a fall vegetable crop or something that needs to be removed. So we do, if something is going to go into, like this field here has onions in it, that might be onions in the foreground of that vegetation there, I think it is, and then there's garlic behind it maybe. So something like onions, where we're going to be transplanting onions in March or April, the onion transplants are set into a terminated winter-killed cover crop. So in the onion area, for instance, of this field was oats and peas, fall seeded for a cover crop, which then terminates over the winter and leaves the stubble on the field for an early spring transplanting. So there's a mix of some different cover crop methods in there too as well. But by and large, mostly what we're looking at is maize solarization of large amounts of cover crops, or moving from one vegetable into another in some of the other more intensive field locations. So this is a picture. So this is a picture of exactly this field. This would have been in July. And this is showing just a mixture of what the field looks like. And so the foreground here has got some summer squash, which is growing healthily. Little leaves are a little small there, but we'll side dress that, and I'll talk about fertilization. The carrots, reasonably good stand. Couple little spots here and there of lack of germination. That's broadcast seeded carrot. And probably the more important thing to look at here is there's never been any weed control in that field. So those are carrots, and they have not seen weed control yet. In fact, this whole field has probably never seen weed control at all at this point. And so you've got beets past the carrots, you've got cabbages, potatoes up in the top there. And so this is just an attempt to show you what it looks like pre-weed control. There's a few weeds in the carrots I see there, and we will certainly come through and eliminate those weeds because we do have absolute weed control. We don't let anything get into flowering or anything, or at least seed production.